In a data-driven world, it's easy to get lost in a maze of metrics. Measurements allow us to track our progress, set goals, and make more informed decisions. But collecting data is one thing. The challenge is knowing how best to use it. So what needs to happen to ensure metrics aren't just numbers on a page, but drivers of real change? Today, we answer the big question: how can we put more meaning into our metrics?
Without measurement, there's a bit of hand-waving, isn't it? You don't know where you're starting and you don't know where you want to go.
Well, decision useful, we said, right, is the core criteria. So if it doesn't support a decision, what's the point of measuring it?
It's not data for the sake of it, it's not measurement for the sake of it. It's not ticking the compliance box, which is not a good use of resources.
Resilience isn't a risk. Resilience is the opportunity to run a business into the future sustainably and profitably.
Hello and welcome to the Green Room by Deloitte. I'm Steph Dobbs and I'm joined on the sofa by my co-host, Annie Wong. We're all familiar with measurement. Whether we're measuring our progress, our impact, or our successes, it provides a baseline of where we are today and where we're going next. But just because we can measure something, that doesn't mean it's actually telling us what we need to know. So, how do we decide what we should be measuring and how best to do it? And how do we use metrics to continuously learn, improve, and move businesses forward? That's what we're exploring in today's episode as we ask, how can we put more meaning into our metrics? Annie, who are we joined by today?
Today, we're joined by David Kennedy, CEO of SBTI, or Science Based Targets Initiative, and we're joined by Veronica Poole, Vice Chair at Deloitte UK. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Hello.
So to begin, let's start with establishing a clear definition of measurement. Why does it matter? What's its purpose? Veronica, I'll come to you first.
Well, I think the old saying goes, we measure what matters. And the reason we say that, because once we measure something, we generally tend to manage it. And so I think it is therefore important to ask what it is that we would like to measure in order to manage. And if you take that for a business today, that's a huge variety of things. So if you think about the world we're all navigating, it's fast changing. So the traditional financial business dynamics, the short-term pressures for profitability need to be weighed along the longer term's lens of the risks the world faces today, whether we're looking at macroeconomics, geopolitics, whether we're looking at sustainability-related issues.
What about you, David?
So look, let's start big picture. SBTI is about working in partnerships with companies who want to make the net zero transition. And that net zero transition is about managing transition risk. And your transition risk is, if I keep my business the same in a changing world, how will that affect me adversely? The business case for action remains very strong, even in the current challenging political circumstances in certain parts of the world. And that takes you to measuring is the starting point for that journey to transition to action, because if you measure something, you can start to manage it. And as you said, you can define a baseline and you can define where you want to get to. And then you can say, well, here's a set of actions that will take us from here to there. Without measurement, there's a bit of hand-waving, isn't it? You don't know where you're starting and you don't know where you want to go. So that really grounds all of the action, which is then defining the net zero transition, which in turn is a very sensible thing for all businesses to be thinking about, committing to, and planning for.
You've sort of touched on it there, but the sort of reasons behind why we actually measure this stuff in the first place, right? Is it to actually make decisions or is it to demonstrate impact? Because often you hear, accusations around box ticking exercises, for example. Where do we start with that?
I think unfortunately there is a lot of box ticking. Before SBTI, I've worked as a partner in a Big Four consultancy, and there's a lot of stuff which is just compliance for the sake of compliance. And that wasn't the point of TCFD, for example, so the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. It's not the point of CSRD, but it is a danger that we get stuck in the measurement, the reporting, we tick the box. Actually, this was all designed so that you can measure something, you can start to understand it. So take your carbon footprint, you understand your carbon footprint. You can see my emissions come from burning gas for heat, fossil fuels generating electricity. You can start to understand your scope 3, which is your supply chain emissions. And then you can ask the question, well, what can I do about each of these? If you haven't measured that, then you can't meaningfully address that question.
And then, David, where does the role of science-based targets come into this? Like, what makes a science-based target better than any other kind of version of measurement or metric? And why do science-based targets matter?
So the science-based target gives meaning to the measurement. And let's just give a quick summary of how science-based targets work. So we've got a climate objective for the world, and that's to limit climate change to well below 2 degrees and as close to 1.5 degrees as possible. And what that means is corporates have to be on the path to net zero by 2050, so getting everything out of their carbon footprint by 2050. Science-based targets translate that climate objective and those high-level emissions pathways that are consistent with it into what is an appropriate ambition for business, and within that for different types of business. So that's where we sit. Going back to the climate risk and the transition risk, so if you don't change your business, you are not going to survive into the future, basically beyond the next 5 and 10 years. If you are thinking medium and long term, you should be transforming your business. Our science-based targets are a guide to the kinds of ambition and pathways that you should be adopting, committing to, in order to manage that transition risk. And just pick out the word I said there, pathways. Again, a pathway has to be defined relative to two numbers, a beginning and an end. And again, measurement, not for the sake of measurement, but measurement for the sake of designing a pathway which then leads you to a set of actions which you can call your transition plan, is what it's all about.
So maybe just to reflect on what David is saying here, so he's giving an excellent application as to how the business generally thinks about metrics. So metrics, they are ultimately measuring specific aspects of performance. Targets is obviously what I'm trying to achieve, and metrics are effectively retrospective or prospective measurement. So they have confirmatory value or predictive value. KPIs, we talk about KPIs quite a lot. They're key performance indicators. They're connected to the strategic impact. So metrics that measure that strategic impact would be our KPIs. And of course, when we set our targets, when we set our metrics measurement, not only are we focused on what needs to be decision useful, but also we need to make them specific, we need them measurable, we need to make them achievable, we need to make them relevant, and they need to support the target. So what David's just described in terms of thinking around transition risk and adaptation risk, so the climate change impact on a business, we need to have clear targets to support any commitment we may have communicated, any purpose we have set out for ourselves. And fundamentally, we need then to have the metrics that allow us to measure progress in the short term, in the long term. And of course, they go to the DNA of the business. They support the functioning of the business. Not only do you need to create appropriate culture around the reliable measurement, relevant measurement, but you also absolutely need to make sure that those metrics are fully aligned with the organizational incentives, with the organizational objective.
Can I just add there, you said something really important. So KPIs. And KPIs is the language of business strategy, commercial strategy, and business planning. On the one hand, we've got transition risk over there as a reporting requirement and a tick box. And then we've got commercial strategy and business planning over here. What we should really have, and I've said the business case for action to manage your transition risk is very strong. So in a world where you've got very visible and increasing climate risk, and it's visible in the form of wildfires and droughts and floods, and we'll see more and more of that. Businesses tell me, and I speak to many businesses in different geographies across sectors, they say the case for action remains very strong.
And it's interesting you say the case for action is very strong. Well, it is, because it is already translating into the real cost to business, the measurable, the here now cost. So if you think about the economic losses incurred in 2024 as a result of climate-related events, we exceeded 450 billion. A lot of it, more than 100 billion, was picked up by the insurance industry, right? So is my business going to be insurable going into the future? That's a big cost consideration for the business. But it is across the whole piece. It's about your resilience of the supply chain. It's where are my operations run? Is it in a sufficiently climate resilient location? Ultimately, will people buy my products in the future? Will I be able to get access to the resources I need? All of these are real business considerations. And this is a classic example where impacts of a company, our impacts on the environment, onto the climate change, have now translated into the direct business dependency. That's the sustainability speak. What does it really mean? It means now it is something that's impacting my access to resources, my ability to do business. It impacts my cost of capital. It impacts my absolute DNA of what I'm doing, my business model. And that goes to the heart of the resilience. So of course
Definitely.
It needs to be actioned.
And we've talked a lot there around sort of resilience of the business and the importance of that moving forward. But I guess also maybe thinking about the benefits it brings for a lot of businesses. So the latest SBTI's latest monitoring report noted the fact there's been a 104% increase in the number of companies adopting science-based targets, but equally market cap value of companies which have adopted science-based targets, actually they grew by 16% in 2023 compared to 2022. So that's quite a big surge, isn't it? So what are maybe some of those other benefits that setting targets brings for companies?
Well, if you set a science-based target, that gives you credibility, first of all. And one of the things the banks are looking at, for example, is have you got a science-based target? And if you have, they will continue to work with you and they may offer you preferential finance, so you can get a few basis points discount if you have got a science-based target. I think the other benefit is where that science-based target goes. And if you've got one, the experience is you get a real focus in a company. And ideally that focus won't just be the Chief Sustainability Officer. It will be the CSO with ops people, with supply chain people, with strategy people, with the finance people, all coming together to transform the business, which again is what this is all about. It's not setting the target for the sake of it. It's not measuring your footprint for the sake of it. It's doing all of these things with a view to action and strategy that's embedded in your commercial strategy. So it's good in the sense of the banks. It's good in the sense that it prepares your business for a world of increasing carbon prices, carbon taxes, cap and trade schemes, regulatory approaches, which will raise your cost base if you are not moving towards being low carbon. So that is really important. With young people, values driven, who can choose where to work and who to work for, if you want the best talent, you're going to have to be net zero. People and young people and talented people, the most talented young people, are not going to work for dinosaur high carbon businesses that are not moving with the changing world and not aligned with their values. And then we've said on the revenue side as well, the opportunity, and it's not really there at the moment, but I think it will be there. So if you look at evidence of buying choices, consumers care increasingly what they are buying. In the middle of a cost of living crisis without good information around the carbon content of products, then it's hard to exercise that value-based consumption at the moment. But over time, as we emerge, fingers crossed, from a cost of living crisis, we're not going to be in perpetual crisis, as people can afford to be more discerning in their choices, and as there's better information, and again this comes back to measurement, we need good product level information around carbon footprints, and we haven't got that at the moment, but there are lots of moves towards it. If you put all of those things together, then people will be drawn in increasing numbers to buying products from companies that are on that net zero transition path. So it just makes a lot of business sense, and it helps contribute to doing the right thing and saving the world as well. So you get a win-win in that respect.
And so, David, you're actually touching on some absolute business fundamentals here, aren't you? So if you actually think about the two things that you are describing here, so again, the first one is the cost of capital. So providers of financial capital, with their banks, with their investors, they want to price risk appropriately. They need to allocate capital appropriately. That is why they're looking for credible target, for proper measurement and progress towards the target to be clearly articulated by companies so that they can measure it and factor it into their own risk-return equations. So, and that's how we allocate capital in a capital market. So, one fundamental of finance. So, we need that information to price the risk appropriately. The other part is, of course, is how the business itself is using the information, how it is run. And what you're describing here, I normally refer to as an integrated approach. So if you want proper alignment of your strategic objective, you need to incorporate that across the whole DNA of how you run your business. So is this effectively in your KPIs? Yes. Is this part of your strategic planning? Is this governed? Is it controlled, accountable for, etc.? That's what then creates that integration and creates that proper strategic focus. So ultimately, it allows you to communicate that target to each and every employee within your business, to each and every stakeholder you interact with. And it is essential if you're going to manage that resilience, that viability of the business ultimately. So what are the benefits? Well, here are two. Access to capital, essential these days, right? Capital is not endless. To access the capital, you need to prove that you are resilient and you actually fit the risk-return appetite of your investor. And then the second thing, of course, is the actual benefit of business resilience. We shouldn't underestimate. It's not just a risk. Resilience isn't a risk. Resilience is the opportunity to run a business into the future sustainably and profitably. So it is a huge benefit, and it is a huge benefit in terms of attracting talent, in terms of absolutely securing your market share, being more competitive, being more successful.
It's really interesting. You spoke about the integrated approach and the importance of good, credible measurement. And I've just been reflecting on what you're both saying. And I think one of the things that I find really interesting is how you balance that with human judgment. Because I've seen instances where certain metrics or measurements or data in general can be quite misleading. And so how do you make sure you've got the kind of guardrails around what you're measuring to make sure that it actually reflects reality and not just what people want to see or want to show?
Very good question, right? Because fundamentally we need the data that supports our decision making not only to be timely and relevant, but it also needs to be reliable. Reliability, of course, is a very important aspect, because if I am going to place my judgment, my decision around a data point, that needs to be trusted as a data point that is going to support the decision, but it's also going to manifest itself in a predictive and confirmatory way, right? So it needs to fulfill its function in the first instance. Applies to any data points, financial, or whether it's GHG emissions, or whether it's estimates about my impact or anything else, right? It applies equally. I need it to be reliable. That means data governance, that means control environment, that means calibration of that data, scenario analysis. It absolutely feeds into various aspects of our thinking, and it needs to function appropriately. So if you want to put the right data governance, you need to approach it the same way as we approach the data governance around financial information today, which is, if you think about how we govern and how we set the data infrastructure for financial information, it's absolutely on the governance of that data is owned by the board, by those charged with governance. We have got clear articulation of the roles and responsibilities and accountability lines. We have got clear documentation around the process, the objective of the process, which allows us to communicate it to all those who are producing data, so they understand the importance of reliability point. And that creates that cultural as well as control environment that then enables me to trust the data. But what you're touching upon here is probably a very interesting aspect here, because once you go outside the financial data, people often say, yes, but there is so much judgment, there is so much estimation involved, and we've got huge data gaps. How on earth are we going to do something? Financial world isn't all about precise numbers either. We absolutely make a lot of judgments about the future day-to-day in our financial projections. Most numbers in the financial statements involve some form of forecasting, some form of estimation. Absolutely need to have the governance around how the estimate is achieved, how it's derived, what's the methodology involved. We need to have clarity and understanding around this. So applies to anything I do around my GHG emissions, for example, whether it's something that I can measure directly versus something that I have to estimate by reference to other data sources, broader data sources. It's the same exercise I do in the financial world. So to me, I think that goes to the heart of putting the right discipline to make sure that even if data is estimated rather than derived from precise measurement, I can still trust it.
Just to add quickly, so reliable data is really important, but it's a journey getting reliable data in the greenhouse gas space, and it doesn't start with perfection. Look at the different aspects of the carbon footprint. So you've got heat, and heat is relatively easy to translate into what are the associated emissions, because we know heat consumption, we know the emissions factor, we can work out heat emissions. We can do the same for electricity. We can do the same for transport, so with logistics and HGVs, for example. Where it becomes more difficult is scope 3, which is your supply chain. And there you will have many suppliers and many different things coming through your supply chain. And how do you work out the carbon footprint? And you start with, you look at your goods and services, and you look at your expenditure, and you apply high-level emissions factors, and already that's useful, because it's telling you where is the carbon footprint coming from, who are the key contributors in your suppliers, and you can start to work with them. And then you can use what's called life cycle analysis, and you can start to break down your scope 3 footprint into electricity and heat and steel and plastic, and then you can work with your suppliers on each of those different things. And over time you can do what's called activity-based rather than expenditure-based. So you can start to really identify what is happening in your supply chain. But each of those steps is very useful. Again, come back to what are you trying to do here? You're trying to identify what are the appropriate actions to take. Now, some of that says emissions is a really important metric and a KPI. So you've got a baseline, you've got a target, you need to move towards that target is a KPI. There's a second set of KPIs which are very useful, and those are tangible, measurable actions that you would find in a transition plan. So if I take the food industry, for example, one of the things, and one of the main things you can do in the food industry to reduce your scope 3 carbon footprint is you can work with the farmers in your supply chain to change their farming practice. And that's something you can actually have action-based, measurable indicators for that then translate into emissions reductions as well.
Looking for a way to make a difference while you shop? Well, with Scope, you can. Scope is one of the national charities Deloitte supports as part of our social impact programme, 5 Million Futures. Visiting any of Scope's retail stores or online shop helps to support their work to create an equal future for disabled people. Every pre-loved item purchased or donated funds Scope's vital services and helps keep millions of items out of landfills. It's good for people and it's good for the planet. Just visit scope.org.uk to find out more.
Because it is that piece, isn't it, around not just tracking things which are available, it's choosing what's actually valuable to track. And I suppose, Veronica, again, maybe drawing on some examples, where do you start with that with an organisation? How do you actually figure out what is valuable either to that business or perhaps to their stakeholders, their shareholders? Where do you start?
Well, decision useful, we said, right, is the core criteria. So if it doesn't support a decision, what's the point of measuring it? And frankly, again, less is often more. We need to measure that's going to be directly relevant to the decision, not just because we can get a data point or we can measure it. That's just the wrong question, that we're wasting our energy if that's what we're doing. What we really need to be doing is measuring stuff, measuring data points that are going to make a difference in our behavior, how we run the business. That's going to inform our decisions first. Second, I think it's the scope of what I need to measure here. And David, you were touching upon value chain data, right? So it's data that sits way outside my direct organizational control. It sits across all of my value chain, all the way from the beginning of the supply to the end of my product's life, customer consumption of my product, customer interaction with my product or service. And so, to me, determining the right scope of measurement is extremely important for the data to be valuable. So, and a classic example, of course, everyone talks about scope 1, scope 2. Well, that's relatively easy. That's pretty much my direct measurement. But scope 3, which is that data from my broader value chain impact, is a good example where it is difficult but important because, frankly, most of my carbon footprint may sit around the value chain rather than in my direct operations, which is often true for oil and gas companies, right? So I think it is really important, therefore, to try and understand, right, what do I need to measure? So define that scope very clearly and set a clear measurement objective here, because if you haven't done that, that data point will not be sufficiently relevant, and therefore it will not be sufficiently valuable for you.
Look, we don't need to reinvent the wheel as well. So there are well-established methodologies that are increasingly reflected in international accounting standards, including for Scope 3. So, there are a number of categories of Scope 3 emissions within the international frameworks, from business travel to employee travel to goods and services as inputs to your business, to downstream related to your customers. The point is then, if you can understand your carbon footprint, even at a high level, and again, it's not about perfection, but if you can understand your carbon footprint, you can start to then address the question, what are the material aspects of it? Business travel is going to be more relevant for some businesses than others. That might be the main lever that they can pull. It might not, depends on the business. So if you go through this methodology, you can see what is material. You can then ask the question, can I influence that material category?
No, you just mentioned one of the most essential words, material, right? So that's the word we use in the world of financial reporting. We're used to that word. That's how we communicate with the providers of capital and our stakeholders. We talk about material matters. Material matters is another definition of valuable. It's valuable for our decision making. It's what's driving our decisions. Decision useful, another accounting term here we use quite regularly. But it's interesting, right, that we're talking quite a lot about climate change, but valuable is across the piece, right? So every interaction of the business with the outside world, its stakeholders with natural resources, etc. That information, is part of the valuable understandings that we need to build as to how the business interacts, what makes it resilient, taking us back to the original point. But I think what's important here is that, take human capital, for example. So you could say, well, there is so much data. It's a data overload. How do I even find my way through that sea of human-related data? And of course, it's the focus on material matters. It's that link that takes you from here is a data point, but how does it affect my ability to create value over time? That's what is the most essential link in the business think or investment think, right? So is this going to be directly affecting value in the short, medium, or long term? So if I can create that direct link, then I'm into what people describe as financial materiality. It's financially material. It's not the next 12 months profits we're talking about. We're talking about value creation over time.
Moving on slightly, so we've spoken about the importance of smart, tangible, credible KPIs and metrics. We've spoken about some of the challenges, particularly around Scope 3. And we've spoken a bit about the things being valuable and not necessarily just measurable. What about meaning, and how are we making sure that what we're measuring, what we're tracking is actually meaningful and is driving change? And if the data isn't showing that and it's not showing what we've hoped for, how do we then make sure that that is seen as an opportunity to do more, to change behaviours, rather than a quote-unquote failure of all the good efforts that people are putting in?
So how do we make it meaningful? I think it's what we've been saying through this conversation, which is we root the measurement in a bigger strategic context. And we remember, what is this all about? It's about transition risk, managing that through setting ambitious targets, with a baseline, with an endpoint as well, and then having a plan to get to it. So that's where the data fits in. It's not data for the sake of it. It's not measurement for the sake of it. It's not ticking the compliance box, which is not a good use of resources. That is very much rooted in, there is a strategic imperative, which this is all driving at. So I would encourage any businesses out there Don't think this is a compliance thing that you've got to go through and you can forget about it and it's not really relevant to the mainstream and the core of the business and the commercial strategy. It has to be very much integrated in that. And if it's not, it's a lost opportunity, actually. There's no point really, apart from you would get some regulatory problems if you don't do the compliance work. There's not much point in it if you're not going to root it in that broader commercial strategy. So that is what I would say. If the data is not showing that your emissions are going down in the way that they should be, that, as you say, is an opportunity. It's an opportunity to ask questions. What's happening? That tells you something about the progress with your strategy towards commercial and competitive success in the future. And it's really important information. So, if emissions are not going down, maybe it's to do with the methodology. Maybe it's because you're not pulling the right levers and you need to do a course correction. It depends on the particular circumstance. But as you say, this is all incredibly valuable and meaningful if you put it in that broader strategic context.
Or in other words, you integrate it into the business process, into your governance, into your measurement, into your reporting. And I think this is what we're really talking about. That's what makes it meaningful. It's not just a question that it can inform your decision and can be useful. It won't if you haven't integrated it into your thinking, organizational thinking, into the DNA.
But of course, sometimes surely the data doesn't always tell us what we were hoping to hear. That's probably the reality of it, isn't it? So I guess from an accountability perspective, what's supposed to happen there? Who takes accountability in an organisation? David?
So look, we shouldn't be looking for what we want to hear, first of all, and that's why data and measuring is really important. So if it tells us that we are not moving in the right direction, we're not moving as quickly as we need to, it raises a question, what are we going to do differently? And then we've got to look at, well, who is responsible for what? Governance is really important, and we reset based on that data. And what kind of reset, who's responsible for it, depends on why the data is not falling as we want it to. But really important insights that we can get there.
And is it just down to the job of the sustainability team, let's say? Veronica, reflections on that?
Certainly not. The right data governance, of course, starts with those charged with governance, and I talked about them effectively setting the tone for the control environment, the tone for data governance, the objective for the data governance, right? And so that doesn't mean a sustainability team, that means the board. And so, in fact, organizational silos are quite damaging in that conversation. What we're really trying to get to is that everyone within the organization understands not only the objective, but how the data supports the objective, why we are collecting the data, why that data needs to be reliable and controlled, right? So that accountability across the whole information chain.
So that's been a really interesting sort of discussion. I think we've talked a lot, haven't we, there about, as you say, risks, the opportunities, how do you actually figure out which data to look at? So we unfortunately do have to now wrap up the episode. So it's time to answer the big question. How can we actually put more meaning into our metrics? We'll start with you, Veronica, then go across.
Well, I started at the beginning, measure what matters, because you will manage it. You will be successful if you're measuring the right things. Make it meaningful. Don't focus on the quantity. It is about the relevance, timeliness, and reliability of that data so that you can make informed decision and the market can trust you.
So I think businesses are already changing, actually, and moving in the right direction. And there's been a period, and you would expect this as the first phase, where companies have responded to regulatory requirements and they've measured stuff without really knowing why they were measuring it and what could they do with it. But I think that is happening now, and companies are moving into that. Well, we've got some data that is giving us insights. So the measurement now is really important. That underpins all of the action, but that's how we should see it. Measurement, action. You can't have meaningful action without measurement, but equally, you can't have meaningful measurement without action. So those two go together with a golden thread.
Love it. Good stuff. Well, thanks both so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Green Room by Deloitte. We release a new episode every other Tuesday with another big question. So don't forget to hit follow or subscribe to this podcast wherever you're listening or watching. That way, you'll be alerted whenever a new episode drops. This podcast is produced by our very own Pod Squad, original music by Ali Barrett.